So I'm making this video after the work's already been done because I didn't realize anybody would be interested in rebuilding a starter. But a few people asked about the details of this rebuild, so here it is. This is a starter from a 1937 MG SA. They're a little hard to come by. Other vehicles did use this model starter, but with a slightly different configuration, position of the switch, that sort of thing. This also is on a wet clutch system. So problem is oil gets past the old seals into the starter, makes a mess of things. That wasn't the worst of it though. In this case, the starter quit working. This is the original armature. It's 85 years old, and you can see why the starter stopped turning. The commutator has been completely worn through. It's gone through the copper and into the mica. So when the brush is turned around to that spot, just stopped working. So the first problem was finding an armature, but fortunately a friend of mine had a starter from another vehicle, and it used the same armature, basically the same armature, just needed a few little modifications. So I was able to get that from him and modify it to fit this starter. So problem here with being a wet clutch is the seals that came on these were cork and I believe leather is the main seal. And those wore out pretty fast. Oil gets through, makes a mess out of the starter. So I had a starter that was full of oil and grunge from who knows how long that had been leaking, and I had an armature that was not working. You can get these rewound. You can get a new commutator put on, but not cheap, and there's not a lot of people doing it anymore, so it was fortunate that I found an armature for that. So the first thing I had to decide was original or paint it black. Original is nickel plated, like you can see here. So spoiler alert, I went nickel. The housing, it had been painted over black, and it had a lot of corrosion pits on it, that sort of thing. And I wanted to get that cleaned up and make it look nice. I decided to go original with it and do the nickel plating. I didn't want to go chrome, that's just a bit too much bling. The nickel really looks a lot more period for a 30s car. So I disassembled the starter and took it down to the local plater, and he told me he can polish out those pits and put the machining lines back into the housing for me. That sounded great to me. I like the originality. The lines on here look really nice. But problem is, his idea of polishing it down was to turn it down on a lathe or something similar and then sandpaper it back. It has more of a brushed finish than the actual milling lines of the original. So I knew I should have done this myself on the lathe and made it perfect, but you know, what's done is done. It's not worth redoing it. The other problem was to get those pits out. He machined it down far enough that the housing is a little bit smaller than it used to be, so the inspection band wouldn't tighten down anymore. I didn't want to modify the original band. I'm kind of a originality freak about some of these things, but I was able to fit it a little differently. I overlapped it this way instead of this way, and it tightened up a little bit. It's good enough. So unfortunately, I also forgot to get the brass tag here plated. It's supposed to be plated with a black infill. Not worth going back, and I kind of like the brass look anyway. So I just went ahead and polished up the brass tag, clear coated it, reused the original rivets to hold it on, and there you go. So with the housing done, I wanted to do something about the seals. There's a primary seal and a secondary seal. The primary is riding on this collar here, and that's what keeps engine oil from the clutch area out of the starter. I wanted to go with a modern lip seal there, and the secondary seal is just a thick piece of cork. It's a ring, goes behind over here against this plate, and that's for when, not if, but when the primary seal fails, oil will not hopefully get into the rest of the starter. They even give you this handy little drain hole on the bottom right there for the oil that gets past, so it can hopefully drain out onto the ground instead of going into the starter. Not a whole lot of confidence in their seal design, I guess, to put an actual drain hole with two seals already in there. So I did manage to find one seal from a company locally here in Southern California, and they had the right dimensions for the most part. It may have been a little bit thin, but I was able to get the seal in there and make a couple tiny modifications and get this shaft completely sealed up. That also required getting this collar off and sticking it in the lathe, turning it down, get a nice smooth polish on it so the seal can have a nice surface to ride on. The seal fit in there tight enough that I'm not worried. It was a little thin. There's a retainer that holds the original leather in there. And even if though the retainer isn't quite hitting the seal, the seal's in really tight. It's not going anywhere. And if it does move, it's only going to move a half a millimeter. I was fine with that. I didn't see any reason to make a new retainer or anything. I just reused all the original parts wherever I could. The secondary seal, I couldn't find any cork that was thick enough, so I used a rubber type seal. It's actually from a plumbing store. A friend of mine asked me, well, what's the heat rating on that thing? My answer is, I don't know. So either it'll do fine or it'll run out that drain hole when it gets too hot. I don't know. We'll see. I think it's okay. It's rated for boiling water, so I think it'll be fine. So in the back half of the rebuild, the brushes needed to be replaced. They were worn unevenly and they were getting a bit low. No reason to go through all this work and not replace those. So someone else told me the part numbers for the brushes on these starters are the same as for an MGTC. I've got a few of those around. I had brushes, great. The part number may be the same, but they're not exactly the same. The SA brushes, two of them have a little bit shorter lead than the TC, two of them have a longer lead than the TC. So I was able to use them anyway. It just made getting the rear plate back on a little tricky, getting the brushes over the commutator. It was kind of tight in there, but it did work. So no problem. The way they're soldered on, you've got the 4 coils inside the housing here, and the brass coil comes up and then wraps around each brush and it's soldered in place. So the first trick was getting those unsoldered. It was a high temp solder, probably silver solder or something like that. So it was kind of tricky with the torch to get that hot enough to melt that solder and not damage the really thin copper strip. A friend of mine had some experience with that, so he came over and helped me out. And it went fine. Cleaned the old solder out, put the new brushes in, folded the copper back over. We used silver solder to reinstall. You don't want to use regular hardware store solder. These connectors can get kind of hot, and safer to use the silver solder. So with that done, the tape on the coils looked fine, just had to clean all the oily goo off of them. Everything looked good, so got everything back into the housing. The switch on the back, it's basically the same as a TC switch. It's a mechanical switch. This lever just pulls contact down and bridges the 2 contact plates, sends current through the starter. Very simple. But the original one had fallen apart. The rear cap was missing, so it was exposed to the elements. Little clip that holds it all together inside fell off. I don't know how it was working. That clip is long gone. So I had a new old stock TC starter switch. I put that on there. The differences are so minor, no one's ever going to notice. I used the original correct round head, flat head screws there. Put a new insulator on it. Put everything all back together. And it didn't work. So I did a little troubleshooting and figured out what happened there. There's a post that comes out of the field coils, and you can see it. If you had the starter switch off, you can see it right down in here. It sticks up through the back plate. There's a hole there where the post comes through, and that post is located on top by a little stepped brass nut that keeps it from hitting the side of that hole. Well, the problem was the bottom, the field coils had been out and messed around with a little bit, so that bottom part of the coil had been bent over a little bit, so the top wasn't touching, bottom was. There was a short. straightened that out, and I added another stepped insulating washer on the bottom. Just so happens that the contact plates, the little insulating washers they use, was a perfect fit. Maybe by design, maybe by accident, I don't know. But it's in there, it's holding it in place. I feel much safer about it. No more failed smoke tests. So about the only other thing I can say here is the bushings on either end are the same as the TC rear bushing. The TC uses a much larger front bushing in the starter, but this uses small on both ends. So I was able to use rear TC bushings to replace the bushings that were in here. One of them was actually really good. The front bushings don't wear out that fast because they're immersed in oil. The rear bushing, I think, is probably going to take a little more of a beating. Bindex assembly was nice. That rebuilt no problem, just cleaned it up, put it back in. New roll pin in the end here. Originally that was a solid pin, I believe, but a roll pin works nicely. And I can't think of much else to say here other than it looks nice, cleaned up nicely. I left the original paint on the inspection band because it's in good shape and I like original finishes. Repainted the front half because that was not looking very good. So there it is, 1937 MG SA starter. Only thing left to do is install it, get a little sealer, because remember it is a wet clutch. You need a gasket on the front of the starter. Nobody makes them, so you can just cut your own out of a piece of gasket paper. Just trace the old one, use a razor blade or something similar. There you go, gasket. Hopefully that goes well and I can get this car back on the road where it belongs. So that's it. Hope this helps.